So, je comprends le français, mais je parle pas bien français, and this is why I switched to English. I apologize. Okay, I'm delighted to be here. I would like to thank Professor Ben-Smile for this invitation. It's really a pleasure. I feel a little bit out of context and out of my comfort zone, but I know I will learn. I'm learning a lot, so it's great to be here. I try to keep it short and simple because I really like to hear your feedback and input. So we are all used to think, we are all familiar with the idea of the brain as a communication machine. We think as brains, communication machine is really a metaphor, but we are familiar to this idea to the point that sometimes we really think that brains are there to process, represent, transmit information. We are less familiar with the idea of movement from an information perspective. So I will focus today on movement from an information perspective. And specifically, I will propose an information-based approach to study movement. And this approach, so why should we be looking at movement from the perspective of information? This approach is motivated by the basic observation that the way we move conveys information. The way we move carries a lot of information. Now you could ask, information about what? Information about the external world. For example, if I grasp an object from the way I approach the object, just the reaching phase of the movement, you can infer the movement, specify the size of the object, the distance of the object, even the weight of the object. So movement carries information about the external world. It also carries information about the internal world, what is inside our brains, cognitive processes, decision processes, and this is what we study in my lab. So what we study in my lab is how movement codes information about internal states. And you can think of movement from this perspective as from an information perspective. Then the question is, how is information, for example, information about internal states, written in the way we move? I will use this writing-reading metaphor a lot today. So the way we move carries information. Information is written in the way we move. And if you think at movement from this perspective, there are a lot of similarities between kinematic coding, so the way information is encoded in movement kinematics, and neural coding, the way information is encoded by neurons. But there are also some interesting dissimilarities. And one important dissimilarity, if you think about it, is that the information that is encoded in movement kinematics is potentially available to others. So information that is encoded in the neural activity is not visible, it's inside our skull. Information in movement kinematics is potentially available to others. And this opens up to an entire set of new questions. So the questions are, what information can human observers read in other movements? How is the information read out? Can information conveyed by movement kinematics act as a social signal to others? Can it be used to communicate something to others or to deceive others? This is what we study in my lab. And what I will present today is a unified framework, a unified approach to study this writing and reading of information in movement kinematics. I will focus on movement kinematics because this is really the focus of my lab, but the same principles that I will describe, you can apply to other measurements, for example, electromyography, and we also apply those principles to electromyography. So, answering the questions that I presented in the slide before, how is information written in movement kinematics? How is it read out? Really requires to crack the kinematic code. And what I will present today is a framework for achieving this, for cracking the kinematic code. And in the last minutes of the presentation, I will present a concrete example of the power of this approach. And the reason why I think this approach is of potential relevance also from a clinical perspective is because these frameworks allow to quantify the information that is written and read out at the single subject, single trial level. And this, the single subject level, is really the level that matters from a clinical perspective. So, in concrete terms, what is a code? A code, you can think of a code, any code, as a method for mapping information from one domain, from one space to another space. So in the case of the neural code, what you are doing is mapping information from the external world to the neural activity. You can think in a similar way, similar logic applied to kinematic code as a method for mapping information about external and internal states to the high-dimensional kinematic space, to the space of movement kinematics, how we move. And as I have already anticipated, there are two complementary processes to this. Kinematic encoding of information, how information is written in movement kinematics, and kinematic readout, how information is read out. And what the framework that I propose enables us to do is basically to understand these different codes. And you could ask, why do you need to distinguish? Why do you distinguish between encoding and readout? Is this really needed? And the answer is yes, because they do not coincide. Human observers are able to read some, but not all the information that is encoded. And how good they are at reading this information really depends on the individual specific code that they use for readout. This is why we need this distinction between encoding and readout. The amount of information that is encoded and is read out determines the social transmission of information. So the information that is socially transmitted is the information that is both encoded and read out. And you can compute this information by intersecting kinematic encoding and readout. So what makes this mapping, the mapping of information to movement kinematics, extremely challenging is the complexity of movement kinematics. Movement kinematics is dynamic and it varies across multiple timescales. It is high dimensional. In our lab, in my lab, we use, to describe the ridge-to-grass movement, we use a 64-dimensional model. It's high, there are many dimensions involved where each dimension is a kinematic variable over time. And in addition to that, you have a lot of variability. You have inter-individual variability, variability from one individual to another, and you have trial-to-trial variability. So what you see here are kinematic traces, specifically wrist velocity and wrist height, recorded during the ridge-to-grasp phase of movements towards a bottle. Movements performed either with the intention to pass the bottle or to drink from the bottle. The bottle stays the same, the amount of water stays the same, the distance stays the same, and yet you see a lot of variability. These are individual traces from repeated measurements of different individual participants. There is a lot of variability. So how do you deal with this variability? normally what you would do and what we have been doing in the lab for many, many years is averaging. You average over trials and you average over subjects to deal with this variability. Now, what is the problem? The problem, to be very clear, is that average kinematics does not exist. This is not how motor control operates. The neuromotor system operates in a very highly individualized way. Studying average kinematics obscures the information that is encoded in movement kinematics. If we want to reveal this information, we need a method, we need an approach to be able to study this mapping at the individual trial level, at the single subject in the single trial level. Because of all this variability, this mapping between information and movement kinematics is best conceived, best understood as a probabilistic mapping. So what you basically need is a method to establish a probabilistic mapping between the information and the kinematics. Why probabilistic? Because there is a lot of variability. And there are several approaches to compute this mapping, parametric, non-parametric approaches. In a simple case where your outcome is a binary variable, a binary outcome, for example, say you want to understand whether the movement encodes the intention to pass to another person or to drink from the bottle. So we are looking for the encoding of prospective information in the reach to grasp phase of the movement. We want to know whether the movement specifies the intention to pass or to drink. And what we do is we use a simple, for example, logistic regression to compute the probability that a specific movement is performed with an intention given the single trial kinematics in that movement. This is what you see here. So basically, movement 1, this is a specific movement, and this is the probability that the movement is performed with the intention to pass. How do you compute this probability? Based on the single trial kinematic, the specific kinematic of that movement. So in this specific case, we computed the probability, the posterior probability that the movement is performed with the intention to pass as the logistic regression of the single trial kinematic vector of that movement. And of course, different movements will have different probabilities because of the variability that we saw before. So if you look here, for example, this movement will have a lower probability of to drink with respect to one of those movements, right? Now, the beauty of this approach is that it allows you, it enables to quantify the amount of information, in this case, intention information that is encoded at the single movement level. And this amount of information is simply the probability that the movement is performed under that specific cognitive state. So with this method, you have a way to quantify the amount of information, in this case, intention-related information, that is encoded at the single movement level. And if you use a simple classifier, a linear classifier such as logistic regression, then there is another advantage. And the other advantage is that the coefficients in the logistic regression, so the weights that you assign to different kinematic features, you can interpret. And this feature, these weights, describe the contribution of that specific feature to the encoding of information. So, in brief, this is the code. Now we have the code. Now we know how we can quantify how much information is there, the amount of information, but we also have a way to understand how this information is written. This is how information is written. Once you have that, so this is for encoding. So how information is encoded in movement kinematics. What you can do is reverse the process and now crack the code that is used for reading this information. How do you do that? So what we do in the lab is we ask participants to watch videos corresponding to the recorded movement, and after each video, we ask them to guess the intention of the agent in grasping the movement. I will show you the videos. It's super difficult, and this is why subjective, if you ask participants after the experiment, they will tell you, I was just guessing. Please do not waste your time looking at my data. I was just guessing. But indeed, it's difficult, but it's not just guessing. They are able to, above chance level, to extract some information. I show you the videos. So this would be to pass, and this would be to drink. So the way it works is that after each movement, you are asked to guess. And we never present the same movement more than 4 times during a session that typically contains about 200 movements. Why? Because we take the variability in movement kinematic seriously, and we really want to know the code that participants are using to read information in this variability. You collect the responses, so the intention choices after each video, and then what you do is exactly the same you did before with encoding. The only difference is that now, instead of predicting, using the machinery to predict the intention with which the movement was performed, now what you try to predict using machine learning is the intention choice of the observer. So this is the trick, basically. You use exactly the same models. Here again, we used logistic regression, but this time, instead of trying to predict the intention of the movement, to classify the intention of the movement, you use logistic regression to classify the intention choice. And the posterior probability that the observer judges this movement to be performed with the intention to pass basically provides you with a measure of the intention information read out by that specific observers in that specific movement. I hope this is clear. And again, if you use a linear approach, such as logistic regression, you can really interpret the coefficients. So you basically understand what are the specific features that that specific observer, Professor Besmail, is reading from that specific movement. And what you will observe if you do something like this is that you have some good readers and you have some bad readers. So there is a lot of variability, not just in the way we move, but also in the way we read information. An ideal observer, never encountered during an experiment, would assign to the kinematic features exactly the same weights that these features have in the encoding model. That would be the perfect code, right? So the ideal observer would read kinematics information with the ideal code that corresponds to the code with which information is written in movement kinematics. A good observer, you have it here, uses a code that is similar to the code that would be ideal to read this information. And a bad observer, as you can see here, uses a different code. And what is quite interesting is that you have, as usual, there is one way to be right, but there are many ways to be wrong, right? And in terms of not so good readers, you have different phenotypes. You have some bad readers that are bad because they do not read information. You could say that these observers, these perceivers, show a form of kinematic blindness. They are not able to read the information that is there. But then we also see, and those are my favorites, some bad readers that are bad, not because they do not read the information, but because they read the information incorrectly. So they are able to identify the specific kinematic features that encode information, But then, when extracting this information, they got it wrong. So in this specific case, for example, this is what is illustrated here. Suppose that this is wrist height. What this suggests is that an increase in, this is the ideal code, an increase in wrist height indicates a higher probability of intention to pass than to drink. What this observer, perceiver is reading is the opposite. So this person takes an increase in wrist height as indicating a higher probability to drink rather than to pass. So this would be an observer whose readout is misaligned with compared to encoding. So he reads the kinematics, but incorrectly. All of this applied to a concrete example. This is a recent experiment in which that I chose this to illustrate the power of this approach to predict, to make testable predictions at the single subject, single trial level. So what we did in this study was participants came to the lab and we asked them to perform a primed action categorization task. So they saw a picture like this, and they were simply asked after each picture to say whether it was pouring or drinking. The content of the picture is totally obvious, but we reasoned that if participants extract information from movement kinematics and do this spontaneously, then their response times to these pictures should be influenced by the presentation of a prior action, reaching action performed with the intent to pour or to drink. So specifically, the idea was that if you spontaneously read information in movement kinematics, then you should be faster at saying pouring when pouring is preceded by a video showing a reaching act performed with the intent to pour. Vice versa, you should be slower at saying pouring when pouring, the picture, is preceded by a video of an action, a reaching action performed with the intent to drink. It's a bit extreme because, as I said, the content of the picture is totally obvious. Why should you be using information if you can simply answer looking at the picture? The idea was that our brains is using this information even if this is uninstructed in a spontaneous way. And this is indeed what we observed. So these are the response times to drinking and pouring actions. And what you see is that participants are faster at saying drinking when drinking is preceded by a reach to drink action, and they are slower at saying drinking when drinking is preceded by a reach to pour action. And of course, the opposite is true for pouring. We describe this as a form of kinematic priming. This is the first time that this phenomenon was established and is extremely relevant because it suggests that even if you are uninstructed, you read information in movement kinematics and you use this information to predict other people's actions. And this, of course, has huge implications for social interaction because this is the motivation of the study. This is what we do all the time, even if we are not aware of doing this. We extract information from the way other people move, and we use this information to make predictions about what's coming next. We also saw that it was the first time, so we wanted to be sure. We wanted an independent measure of kinematic priming. And so we also looked independently in a separate analysis at initial fixations. And what we saw is that initial fixations were also predicted by the kinematic prime that was shown before the image. So basically, the probability that the first fixation lands on a task-relevant region is higher for congruent trials than incongruent trials. Now comes the exciting part. 1 hour after this, we asked participants to come back to the lab and do another task. And the task was super boring, consisted in simply judging the intention of the videos, of the actions shown in the videos used as kinematic primes. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to compute readout computations. We wanted to compute for each individual participant the readout code. And this is what we did. And what you see here is at the single subject level, the readout code. So the first row is how information, these are the kinematic features that we considered. So here specifically we have 16 kinematic features. This would be wrist height and so on. This is how information is written in these features. So you see, the space of movement kinematics is a high dimensional space, but information is encoded in a much lower dimensional space. Basically, there are only 3 features that contribute to kinematic encoding. An ideal observer would read these 3 features. But what you see in reality, these are the 20 individual human perceivers that participated in the study. You see a lot of variability. We have some good readers, some not so good readers that read only 1 feature, and then we have participants such as participant 10 or 19 that basically show what I described before as a form of kinematic blindness. They do not read any information. So having this, what we did was going back to the results of this task and see whether, based on this, we could predict kinematic priming at the single subject, single trial level. And this is indeed what we found. So single trial intention readout, so readout computed at the single subject, single trial level, was predictive of the amount of priming, both in terms of reaction times and in terms of fixations. So in other words, the amount of information that you read from a specific movement predicts how much this movement will influence your action predictions in a separate task, a separate session. And this, I think, it's quite exciting because it suggests that the readout code is quite stable over time, or at least stable enough to predict the behavior of a specific individual perceiver in a separate session 1 hour later. What we don't know is whether this code remains stable over days, years, how it changes with experience, how it changes as a function of age. This we don't know. We know that it's stable enough to be able to predict how the participants behave 1 hour before. So what you see here, so that you don't have to struggle, is basically, this is response times. And what you see here is the amount of information that the individual participant is extracting from a specific movement. And what you see is that for congruent trials, in blue, the more information you extract 1 hour later, the faster you are at classifying the drinking image. For incongruent trials, the opposite. This is also quite nice. So because you use this information, when the information is incongruent, you pay a cost, right? You are slower at classifying the picture as pouring because you extracted information about drinking and now you expect to see a drinking action, but what is presented is a pouring action, and so there is a cost in this extraction of information. Why do we do that then? Well, because in real life, normally, the information that is encoded in movement kinematics is predictive of what comes next. And this is my last slide. And I made this exercise yesterday of trying to list what are the questions that might have an interest from a clinical perspective that you could think of addressing within such a framework. One question that I think it's quite interesting, something we have been discussing for quite some time with Professor Molteni from Villa Beretta, is use this approach to assess orders of planning. This is the idea. Intention information is second order planning, right? It's not about the object, it's about what you're going to do next with the object. So not first order, second order planning. But you can extend this logic to study third order planning, fourth order planning. And indeed, in the lab, what we have seen is that healthy participants plan up to the fourth order. And what is the logic? The logic is the same. You only need to study the reaching kinematics, and you look for the encoding of nth order information in the reaching kinematic. If nth order information is encoded in the reaching kinematics, then you can infer that nth order planning has taken place. So the power of this approach, the idea of this approach and the power of this approach is that you only need to analyze the reach to grasp phase of the action. And this, of course, could have an advantage, especially thinking about those patients that would not be able to complete a complex action sequence. So you could study their planning abilities simply by analyzing the reach to grasp kinematics. And of course, the same logic you can apply to readout, and you could apply the same logic to study how far in the future perceivers read information about a given action. Another interesting question could be about suboptimalities and abnormalities in the readout of encoded information. So I hope I have convinced you with what I've shown before that this approach really makes it possible to open what can be described as the black box of trial average discrimination accuracy. You ask participants to perform the task I've shown you before, so discriminate intention from observing reach to grasp movements. And what you see is that the participant is a chance. This is the information that you get if you simply analyze accuracy, so fraction correct. But why? It could be because the participant is not reading any information, or it could be because the participant is reading, but in the incorrect way. And this is in what we applied this approach recently in a paper where we study participants, patients with psychosis. And there is a lot of heterogeneity, and of course the intervention would be completely different depending on whether the person is blind to the information or whether the person is reading the information incorrectly. Another related idea is kinematic fingerprinting. So basically, it's analogous to what people do with the connectomics. You can train models on the data of individual participants, as we have seen, and this provides you with a profile of that specific individual, both in terms of information encoding and readout. And once you have that profile, you can use that profile, for example, to stratify participants or to predict specific cognitive and clinical phenotypes. And another possibility would be to use this approach, and this is what we did in this paper, to determine whether individuals read information in movement kinematics in the same way they write this information. So this is about the similarity of encoding and readout codes. You have all heard about mirror neurons, the idea that you use your internal models to read, to predict other people's actions. This would predict that the same code you use to write in your movement, you use to read other people's movement. And this, if you think about it, has huge clinical implications. One implication that we explored in this paper, for example, relative to autism, is that if this is true, then it is not because individuals with autism move in a way that is dissimilar with compared to typical individuals. The implication is that they will have difficulties reading the actions of typical individuals. But also the other way around, typical individuals that move with a kinematics that is different will have difficulties interpreting, reading the actions of individuals with ASD. And this, of course, extends to any disorder where you have an abnormality in terms of motor control. And finally, to conclude, you can use this approach to assess the efficacy of intervention. So normally you assess the efficacy of intervention comparing pre-post kinematics or pre-post EMG. This approach provides a way to refine this by making it possible to really assess the influence of intervention on specific components that change after intervention. And this you would do by comparing the kinematic, the encoding of a specific dimension pre-post intervention. Thank you. Just to mention that those were the people that contributed to the studies and our sponsors.
Une question, parce qu'on a bien dépassé.
Thank you very much. Do you know what makes, in general, a good reader? One person that will be efficient to read a movement, doesn't matter the person doing it. So, yeah, skills.
This is a question that we had. We tried to. We normally at the end of an experimental session, we administer several questionnaires, several tests, and we try to correlate. Nothing, absolutely nothing. We do not see any correlation with theory of mind, empathy, nothing. One laboratory, colleagues from the CNRS of Lyon, using the very similar approach, they see a correlation between the ability to read information in movement kinematics and a test, maybe you know it, it's called reading the mind in the eyes test. Basically, you are only shown the eye region of a face and you are asked to guess what is the emotion of the face in the picture. Other than that, no correlation. And there is a lot of variability, as you have seen. So where this variability comes from, we do not really understand. How it is shaped by experience, we don't know.
And same for the encoders. There are no good encoders that are well read by everyone.
Yeah, no, they are. This is the thing, that some individuals are much more readable than others. And if you think about it, this has huge implications for social interactions. Because if I like the good encoder. If I'm a good encoder, then I'm more readable, and possibly social interaction with me is easier than if I'm a bad encoder. And again, this has not really been studied, and we don't know what are the implications. I mean, again, this has clinical implications, because you can think that in presence of motor abnormalities, this could make you a bad encoder.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another last question.
Thank you, Cristina. From a clinical perspective, in physical medicine rehabilitation, we use action observation to treat a patient. Starting from your point of view, it's possible to define patient bad readers and patient ideal readers to use a technique like this one to improve the ability to learn a movement?
I think it's a very good point. I mean, first of all, what you could do is you can define the readout profile of a specific patient and compare pre-post intervention and see how this profile changes. If the profile changes, then you can conclude that the intervention was effective, otherwise probably not. And how you structure the intervention could be specifically targeted to a dimension, to a subcomponent of reading that you want to restore. So in the case, suppose the bad readers, those that read information but do this in an incorrect way, you may want to amplify differences in movement kinematics and provide feedback to teach them how to interpret the information. If a person is blind to the information that is encoded in movement kinematics, then probably the kind of stimuli that you would use are different. So I think that this opens up also to the possibility of tailoring the intervention to the specific components of encoding and readout that you want to improve.